The desert had its own kind of music. It wasn't the kind you heard with your ears, but the kind that sank into your bones. The hush of wind over stone, the rustle of dry grass, the faint hum of insects as the sun bled gold across the mesas. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the last echo of a church bell carried across the evening air, long and lonely. San Miguel de la Cruz stood on the edge of that vast emptiness, a small chapel of weathered adobe and cracked bells, surrounded by nothing but open land and a scattering of cottonwoods trying to survive the heat. Its whitewashed walls had faded to dust-colored tan, and its cross leaned slightly eastward as if bowing to time. Yet, every evening when the light turned amber, the old chapel looked almost holy again, bathed in the glow of something eternal. Inside, Sister Miriam moved quietly down the aisle, the hem of her plain habit whispering across the stone floor. She carried a brass candlestick in one hand and a watering pail in the other. The last of the orphans had already gone home for the night, their laughter still echoing faintly in her memory. She paused near the altar, lighting each candle one by one, their flames flickering like small prayers reaching upward. She did not speak. She hadn't spoken in 6 years. The silence wasn't forced. It had become her world, her way of breathing. The absence of sound had turned into a kind of language, one she shared only with God. When she prayed, she did so through gestures, the way her hands folded tightly, the way her eyes closed longer than most, the way her lips trembled when she thought of the man she'd once loved. The chapel garden waited behind her, small but alive, rows of herbs, sage, and wild roses fighting the dry soil. She knelt to tend them every morning before the sun rose, and every evening before it set. The roses, she believed, bloomed only because she whispered to them in her heart, not aloud. Perhaps they understood silence better than anyone else. The wind outside sighed against the chapel walls, and she turned toward the door, her eyes catching on the crucifix above the altar. Christ's carved face looked weathered and kind, worn by years of dust and prayer. Beneath that gaze, Miriam felt both burdened and comforted. She had promised God that her voice would never again cause harm. It had been her vow, the only way she knew how to atone for a love that ended in blood. Years ago, she had been Miriam Shaw, the preacher's daughter, full of laughter and words. Her fiancé, Thomas Blake, had been a lawman with dreams of cleaning up a crooked town. She remembered his smile, the way his hat always tilted just a little too far back, and the way he'd said her name like it meant something sacred. Then one afternoon, the gunfight happened. 6 shots in the street outside the saloon. She had run to him, screaming his name, but it was too late. He died in her arms, and the last thing he'd said was, "Don't cry, love. I'll meet you where there's peace." But peace had never come. Not really. Her grief had twisted into silence, her sorrow into prayer. When the Sisters of the Order found her wandering the desert roads a year later, she'd already stopped speaking. They gave her a home at San Miguel, and she gave them her vow to live in silence, service, and solitude for the rest of her life. It was not punishment. It was penance. Now, 6 years later, the silence had become who she was. The world had changed around her. New ranchers, new outlaws, new graves, but she remained the same quiet figure in the same faded chapel. The townsfolk called her the silent nun of San Miguel. Some pitied her, others feared her. A few even said her prayers could heal, that her voice had been given to God Himself. Miriam never listened to what they said. She simply worked. She cleaned the pews, taught the children their letters, and at dusk played the chapel's old organ. The instrument was missing several keys and wheezed like an old man's lungs, but under her hands it sang. The melody carried far beyond the walls, drifting across the barren land like a hymn for the lost. Tonight, the song was softer than usual, almost like a lullaby. She played for herself, for Thomas, for every ghost that lingered in the shadows. Her fingers moved lightly, her eyes closed. For a moment, she felt something stir deep inside her chest, a warmth, fragile and unfamiliar. It almost felt like hope. Then she heard it, the sound of hooves. At first, it was faint, a distant rhythm carried on the wind, but it grew louder, faster, a rider approaching. Few ever came this far out after dark. The nearest town was miles away, and the trail was dangerous at night. She froze, her fingers still on the keys, her breath caught between fear and curiosity. The hooves stumbled. The sound turned uneven, desperate. Then came a heavy thud, something falling to the ground. Miriam rose quickly, candlelight flickering against her face. She crossed the chapel floor and pushed open the wooden doors. The night greeted her with cool air and silence, broken only by the soft groan of a dying horse. The moon was low, spilling silver light across the courtyard. A dark figure lay slumped near the steps, broad-shouldered, dressed in dust and blood. His horse stood a few feet away, trembling, its reins tangled. Miriam's heart quickened. She grabbed her candle and stepped closer, her sandals whispering against the dirt. The man's hat had fallen beside him. His face was shadowed, but she could see the blood staining his shirt, the glint of metal near his waist. A revolver. She froze, instinctively clutching the small wooden cross hanging from her neck. Outlaws passed through these lands often enough. Most brought nothing but trouble. Still, she could not leave him there. Setting the candle down beside him, she knelt. His breathing was shallow, labored. A bullet wound, high in the side, the blood dried around it. He'd been shot hours ago, maybe more. His lips were cracked, his skin pale beneath the dirt. She pressed her fingers gently to his neck. There was a pulse, faint but steady. Her eyes softened. Whatever he was, whoever he'd been, he was still a man. Still one of God's lost children. She rose, fetching a water jug from the garden well, and a strip of linen from her robe's hem. The horse watched her with wary eyes, nostrils flaring as if guarding its master. She whispered in her heart, "Peace, creature, I mean no harm." Then she returned to the stranger's side and poured a little water over his wound. He groaned, flinching weakly. She didn't speak, not even a whisper. Instead, she worked with quiet efficiency, cleaning the wound as best she could, binding it tight. He was unconscious again before she finished. When she tried to move him, she realized just how heavy he was. It took all her strength to drag him to the chapel steps and through the doorway, inch by inch. By the time she laid him on a pew near the altar, her arms trembled with exhaustion, sweat mixed with the dust on her face. But she didn't stop. She fetched another candle, set it beside him, and covered him with a blanket she used for the orphans during winter. For a while, she simply stood there, watching him. The flickering light revealed more details now. The rough stubble along his jaw, the scar cutting across his temple, the faint smudge of gunpowder on his fingers. He looked dangerous, yet strangely peaceful in his sleep. The kind of peace that comes only when a man has nothing left to lose. Miriam's gaze drifted to the gun belt hanging at his side. She hesitated, then unbuckled it and set it near the altar, far from his reach. The weapon felt cold, heavy in her hands. She hadn't touched one since the day Thomas died. Her breath caught. The weight of memory pressed hard against her chest. For a moment, she thought she heard Thomas's voice, soft, gentle. "You can't save everyone, love." But she looked at the stranger again and thought, maybe just this once. She sat near the pew, her candle still burning between them, and waited through the night. The only sounds were the soft crackle of wax, the distant howl of a coyote, and the slow, labored rhythm of his breathing. When dawn began to paint the horizon pink and gold, she finally allowed her eyes to close. Sleep crept up like mercy. But even as she drifted, she felt the weight of something changing. The quiet, steady sense that her peaceful world had just been disturbed, perhaps forever. Outside, the desert wind shifted. The first rays of morning slid through the chapel windows, falling across the wounded stranger's face. For the first time, she saw him clearly. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 30. Lines of hardship carved into his expression, but beneath them, a hint of something gentler, something lost. His lips moved faintly, forming a word she could barely hear. Miriam! Her eyes snapped open. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it. How could he know her name? No one had spoken it aloud in years. She leaned closer, but his eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow. Perhaps it was just the wind playing tricks. Perhaps not. Her hand trembled as she reached to adjust the blanket. The moment she touched him, he stirred, flinching at her presence, his hand moving toward where his gun used to be. She caught his wrist, gentle but firm, and shook her head. His eyes opened, a piercing gray, sharp even through the pain. They locked onto hers, confused, defensive, and then something else. Recognition? No, it couldn't be. But his gaze softened, as if he saw in her not a stranger, but a ghost from a dream. He tried to speak, but she pressed a finger to her lips, signaling silence. Her silence filled the space between them, stronger than words, heavier than fear. He stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling. Finally, he sank back against the pew, eyes fluttering shut again, as if surrendering to something he didn't yet understand. Miriam exhaled, her heart thudding softly in her chest. She looked toward the crucifix once more, her candlelight trembling in the still air. There, in the sacred quiet of dawn, she realized that her vow, her silence, had finally met its test. The desert had sent her a wounded stranger with a gun at his side, and her name on his lips, and though she did not yet know why, she felt in her bones that her life would never again be as quiet as it had been before. When Eli Cade opened his eyes, he thought he was already in heaven. The light that fell through the chapel windows was golden and soft, too peaceful to belong to the world he knew. Then, the pain in his side reminded him otherwise. Heaven didn't ache like this. He groaned, instinctively reaching for his gun. His hand met air. Panic snapped through him. His eyes flew open, scanning the dim chapel. His weapon was gone. Instead, he found himself lying on a wooden pew, his wound tightly bound, his chest covered with a rough wool blanket that smelled faintly of sage. The woman sat nearby, motionless in a chair. The black habit and the white veil told him she was a nun, but there was something unusual about her stillness. She wasn't reading scripture or whispering prayer. She was simply watching him, calm and silent, as if she had been doing so for hours. "Where am I?" His voice came out hoarse, dry as dust. "And who are you?" She didn't answer. Her eyes, gray, steady, and deep as river stone, met his with a quiet he couldn't read. He waited for a word, a sign, anything. Instead, she rose, fetched a jug of water, and poured some into a cup. She held it out for him. He hesitated. "You don't talk much, do you?" No reply. He reached for the cup anyway. Her fingers brushed his as she handed it over, and for a fleeting second, something passed between them, an unspoken recognition. He took a long drink, the coolness burning down his parched throat. "Guess you're the one who patched me up," he muttered. "Didn't expect a nun to take in a dying outlaw." At that, her brow lifted just slightly, though she said nothing. He tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. The movement loosened the bandage enough for blood to seep through. She was beside him in an instant, firm hands pressing him back. He caught a faint scent of rosewater as her sleeve brushed his arm. Her touch was careful but certain, like someone who'd nursed too many wounded souls to flinch anymore. "You're wasting your time," he said between gritted teeth. "A man like me's not worth saving." Still no response. She only met his eyes again, her silence somehow louder than words. He turned away, half laughing. "Suit yourself, sister." The laugh dissolved into a cough. When it passed, the chapel's quiet returned, thick and steady. Sunlight streamed through the narrow windows, cutting across the dust like strands of silk. A bird fluttered somewhere in the rafters. For the first time in years, Eli realized he was somewhere safe. He didn't deserve it, but it was there all the same. He dozed off again. When he woke, it was night. Candles glowed near the altar, throwing long shadows across the pews. The nun sat at the organ, her back to him. Then, softly, she began to play. The melody was fragile at first, hesitant, like someone remembering an old song. But soon it filled the chapel, warm and haunting. The notes wrapped around him, tugging at something buried deep. He hadn't heard music since before his first killing. His chest tightened. For a moment he forgot where he was, forgot the bounty on his head, forgot the ache in his side. When she stopped, the silence afterward felt sacred. He whispered, "That's beautiful." She turned slightly, acknowledging the words with a small nod, then blew out the candle nearest her. The light faded, leaving him in the gentle hush of darkness. Days passed in slow rhythm. He healed under her care, his wound closing cleanly. She never spoke, but somehow he began to understand her anyway. The way she tilted her head meant wait. The small lift of her hand meant stop worrying. She brought him soup, changed his bandages, and listened when he talked. And he talked a lot. He told her about the first time he held a gun, about his father, a miner who drank more than he prayed, about how he left home at 16 and learned to shoot before he learned to read, about the woman he'd once loved, a saloon singer named Rose, who died because of a bullet meant for him. He told her about the duel in Silver Creek that made him famous, the bank job gone wrong, the friend who betrayed him. He confessed it all, because for the first time, there was someone who didn't look at him with hatred or fear. She just listened, her silence a mirror in which he saw his life clearly for the first time. "Funny," he said one evening, staring at the crucifix above the altar. "I used to think silence was weakness. A man had to speak loud, shoot fast, make his mark on the world. But you make silence look strong." She smiled faintly. He caught that smile and held on to it. It had been years since anyone looked at him without disgust. It felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He found himself wondering what her voice would sound like if she ever used it. Sometimes he'd wake before dawn and watch her tending the garden. She'd kneel among the roses, hands in the dirt, her veil catching the wind. She moved with the same grace she played the organ, measured, patient, and full of purpose. The desert sun painted her skin in soft light, and he thought, not for the first time, that she was the only pure thing left in a world that had gone rotten. He tried to help her once. He took a shovel, started to dig a trench near the garden for water flow. She motioned sharply for him to stop. When he didn't, she marched over, snatched the shovel, and pointed toward the chapel door. He raised an eyebrow. "You're real bossy for a nun." She frowned, but there was amusement behind it. "Fine, fine," he said, holding up his hands. "I'll sit still. Don't smite me." Her lips twitched. It became a rhythm, the outlaw and the silent nun, each orbiting the other's wounded soul. Every night, he'd sit near the door, watching the stars spill across the sky. He'd tell her stories about the outlaws he'd known, the saloons he'd seen, the towns he'd fled. She'd listen, occasionally lighting candles one by one, as if each flame was a prayer for the men he spoke of. He began to realize how much he needed that silence. It didn't judge him, it forgave him before he even asked. But the world doesn't let a man like Eli Cade stay hidden for long. One afternoon, while Miriam was hanging linen behind the chapel, a dust cloud appeared on the distant road. 3 riders, moving fast. He recognized their stance, even from far away. Bounty hunters. His blood went cold. He limped to the door, scanning the horizon. They were still a mile off, but closing. He grabbed his gun belt from the altar. She appeared behind him, startled by the urgency in his movement. He turned to her. "I've got to go. They'll be here soon." She shook her head sharply. "You don't understand," he said. "If they find me here, they'll think you're hiding me. You'll get hurt." She reached for his arm, her grip firm. She pointed to the wound still tender beneath his shirt, then to the pew, as if ordering him to stay. "I can't," he said. "They'll kill me." Her eyes burned with something fierce, a kind of faith he'd never seen in anyone. She touched the cross on her chest, then pointed to him. The meaning was clear. You are safe here. He wanted to believe her. God help him, he did. But he'd spent too many years running. He'd buried too many men who believed in mercy. "I can't drag you down with me," he said. "You've done enough." He turned toward the back door, but before he could reach it, she stepped in front of him, blocking the way. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, small, calm, unyielding. He felt his chest tighten. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you doing this?" Her expression softened. For a long moment, she held his gaze, then slowly placed a hand over his heart. Her touch was warm, steady. Then she pressed her palm to her own chest. The meaning hit him like a bullet, because I've lost someone, too. He swallowed hard, unable to look away. The memory of Rose flashed through his mind. Her laughter, her death, the emptiness that followed. He understood now. They were both survivors of grief, both living on borrowed faith. The hoofbeats grew louder. He looked out the window. "They're almost here." She moved quickly, extinguishing candles, closing shutters, dimming the chapel. The organ loomed in shadow. The smell of wax and dust thickened. She motioned for him to hide near the confessional booth. He hesitated, but obeyed. Through the cracks of the wood, he watched her walk to the door as the riders arrived. The lead hunter dismounted, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Evenin', sister," he called, hat low over his eyes. "We're looking for a man. Name's Eli Cade. You seen him?" She stood still, her hands folded. "Don't go quiet on me now," the man said. "He's a killer. Shot 2 lawmen up near Santa Fe. Word is he headed south. Folks said he might be hiding here." Her face didn't move. The silence stretched. The man chuckled, mean and lazy. "Guess the good Lord took your tongue, huh? Shame. A woman that pretty shouldn't waste her looks on prayer." Eli's hands tightened on his knees. Rage burned hot in his chest. The hunter stepped onto the first stair of the chapel. "Mind if we take a look around?" Miriam raised a hand, blocking his path. Her gesture was slow, deliberate. The cross around her neck glinted in the dim light. "What's that supposed to mean?" the man sneered. "This is God's house, ain't it? You gonna keep us out?" Still, she said nothing. But there was a calm authority in her silence that even he could feel. He shifted uncomfortably. Eli watched, heart pounding. Finally, the man grunted. "Fine, we'll look elsewhere. But if you see him, sister, you tell him Eli Cade's luck's run out." He swung onto his horse, spat again, and rode off. The others followed, kicking up dust that swallowed them whole. When the sound faded, Miriam stayed frozen for a long moment. Then she turned toward the confessional. Eli stepped out slowly, his breath shaking. "You could have died," he whispered. She looked at him, eyes filled with both defiance and mercy. He tried to speak again, but words failed. Finally, he said, "You should have let them take me." She shook her head once. "Why not?" For a moment, her eyes glistened. Then, with trembling fingers, she traced a small cross over his heart. It was the only answer she gave. That night, she returned to the organ. Her fingers trembled as she began to play. The melody this time was stronger, braver. He sat near the doorway, listening in silence, the notes washing over him like forgiveness itself. When she finished, he whispered, "If I'd met you a few years sooner, maybe I wouldn't be the man I am." She turned to him, and though she didn't speak, the look in her eyes said what words never could. It's not too late. He didn't know it yet. But from that night forward, something inside him began to change. The outlaw who once rode only toward death was, for the first time, beginning to want to live. The days that followed passed in the hush of slow healing. The desert wind softened, and the air around the chapel grew warmer, touched with the faint sweetness of blooming sage. The danger had passed, at least for now, but neither Miriam nor Eli spoke of the men who'd ridden up the hill that day. The memory lingered between them like a ghost neither wanted to wake. Eli spent most mornings outside, his strength returning, though the pain in his ribs still flared if he moved too fast. Miriam never scolded him anymore for doing too much. She simply appeared beside him, her quiet presence enough to slow his recklessness. He had stopped trying to read her silence as mystery. Now he read it as steadiness, the one thing in his life that didn't shift beneath his feet. He repaired what he could around the chapel. The roof above the garden leaked when it rained, so he patched it with salvaged tin. He rebuilt the fence post by post. When the wind took one of the shutters clean off, he carved a new one by hand. He hadn't built anything with care in years, but somehow his hands remembered how. Every nail he hammered down felt like another sin buried. Miriam watched him sometimes from the doorway, her hands folded in her apron. She didn't stop him anymore. Maybe she understood that labor, for a man like him, was its own kind of prayer. The orphans began to return when the news spread that the silent nun was teaching again. They ran barefoot through the courtyard, their laughter scattering dust into sunlight. Eli fixed the swing for them, tightened its ropes, painted it with leftover oil from the lanterns. When one of the boys, Mateo, fell and scraped his knee, Eli carried him to the chapel steps and poured water over the cut. The boy looked up at him and asked if he was a priest too. Eli laughed softly. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at him without fear. That night, when the children left, Miriam found him still sitting on the steps, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "You ever think God lets men start over?" he asked, not looking at her. She didn't answer, only knelt beside him and began tending the small rose bush at the edge of the path. Her fingers brushed soil from the roots. He waited for her to write something on the small slate she sometimes used, but she didn't. She simply touched the earth, pressed it down gently, and looked toward the sky as if that was answer enough. He followed her gaze. The stars stretched endless over the desert, bright and sharp. He sighed. "Guess that means yes." Over time, the silence between them changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was companionable. They spoke through looks, through gestures, through the quiet rhythm of shared work. He came to understand her expressions. The slight furrow of her brow when she disapproved. The rare but luminous smile that could undo a whole day's weariness. One afternoon, while she prepared bread inside, he found himself staring at her hands. They were small, strong, the skin faintly rough from work. He wondered what they'd feel like if she ever touched him, not in care, but in tenderness. The thought startled him so much that he almost burned the wood he was cutting. He told himself not to think that way. She belonged to God. But his heart didn't listen. That evening, she lit candles across the chapel, her movements slow and deliberate. He sat near the back pew, watching the light build in layers across the walls. When she sat at the organ, he could tell by the way she hesitated that she was tired. Still, she began to play. The first note trembled but found its way forward, and soon the room filled with sound again. He closed his eyes. He had stopped counting the nights he spent listening to her music. It had become his salvation. Each song felt like a confession, every pause like absolution. When she finished, the last chord hung in the air for a long, shivering moment before fading into quiet. He rose and stepped closer. "That piece," he said softly, "what's it called?" She turned toward him, hesitated, then pointed toward the crucifix. "For him?" he asked. She nodded. "It sounds like forgiveness," he said. Her gaze lingered on him, and in that look he felt more forgiven than he ever had in a church full of words. He wanted to tell her everything then, every life he'd taken, every mistake that had built the walls around his heart, but the words tangled in his throat. He didn't want to break the fragile peace that held them, so instead he said, "You're different from any saint I ever heard about." A faint smile crossed her lips, shy and fleeting. The nights grew colder as the season shifted. Miriam began leaving the chapel door open a crack for him to stay inside when the wind picked up. He slept near the hearth, on a simple cot he built himself. She slept in the small room behind the altar, the door always left slightly ajar, a candle burning in the threshold. Some nights, he'd wake to the sound of her footsteps, her checking on him, ensuring his wound hadn't reopened. He'd pretend to be asleep, afraid to break whatever fragile trust had formed between them. Then came the day she finally told him her story, not with words, but with memories she let him see. It started when she brought out a small wooden box. Inside was a folded photograph, old and faded. A young man stood beside her, dressed in a sheriff's badge, his arm around her shoulders. Her face in the picture was bright, unshadowed, full of joy. She handed him the photograph and waited. He studied it carefully, then looked up. Her eyes glistened. She pressed her fingers to her lips, then to the man in the photo, and finally pointed toward the cross above the altar. He understood. The man was dead. The vow of silence had been her offering to God for the soul she'd lost. He looked at her for a long time. "You think silence can buy peace?" he asked quietly. Her expression shifted. Pain, understanding, doubt. Then she shook her head. She took the photograph back, held it against her chest, and whispered without sound, "Number. But it keeps me from breaking again." He wanted to say that pain never stayed buried, that it only waited for a softer day to rise again, but he didn't. Instead, he reached out and covered her hand with his. For a moment she let him. The air between them stilled. Her hand trembled, but she didn't pull away. Then she rose abruptly and turned from him, leaving him with the hollow ache of something sacred that could never be his. That night, he didn't sleep. He walked outside, the stars cold and bright above. The chapel looked almost golden in the moonlight. He leaned against the fence, staring at the horizon. Somewhere out there were men who still wanted him dead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. The fear had been replaced by something deeper, hope. And hope was far more dangerous. The next morning, he found a letter nailed to the chapel door. It bore no name, only a bounty notice. Eli Cade, alive, $800. He tore it down before Miriam saw it. Though he suspected she already knew, there was no hiding from her kind of knowing. That afternoon, she found him sitting by the garden wall, the paper burning in his hand. She knelt beside him, her face full of quiet sorrow. He expected reproach, but she only reached into her sleeve and drew out a small piece of folded cloth, a patch of white linen embroidered with a cross. She pressed it into his hand. He looked at it, confused. "What's this for?" She pointed toward his chest. He shook his head. "You don't know what I've done. That cross don't belong on me." Her eyes softened. She mouthed one word. He couldn't hear it, but he could read it on her lips. "Now it does." He looked away quickly, afraid she'd see the tears burning behind his eyes. The days turned into weeks. The rhythm of work, prayer, and music filled every corner of the chapel. Sometimes he caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. He didn't know what she saw, a sinner trying to be good, or a man already half redeemed. One evening, a sandstorm rolled across the desert without warning. The sky went dark as smoke, wind howling through the cracks in the walls. They hurried to secure the shutters, but one of the outer doors burst open, slamming hard against the frame. The storm swept in, tearing through candles, scattering papers. Eli grabbed the door, forcing it shut, the wind roaring in his ears. Miriam tried to help, but the gust pushed her backward. He reached for her just as a beam from the roof broke loose. It crashed down where she'd been standing a heartbeat before. He pulled her against him, shielding her as debris rained down. The noise was deafening. Dust filled the air. She clung to his coat, trembling, her face pressed against his chest. When the wind finally died, the silence that followed was absolute. He looked down at her, her veil tangled, cheeks streaked with dust. She met his gaze, wide-eyed, breathless. Neither moved. He realized he was still holding her, his hands firm against her back. He should have let go, but he couldn't. Not yet. Her lips parted slightly, as if she might finally speak. The moment stretched, too long, too fragile, and then she stepped back, eyes downcast, pulling away. He let her go. Afterward, she cleaned the chapel without a word, her movements brisk, almost sharp, but her hands trembled when she passed him the broom. He took it, understanding without needing to ask. That night, when she played the organ, the music was different. Wilder, aching, a song of something she could no longer hide. He sat in the shadows, listening, knowing that whatever bound them together had just deepened beyond anything he could undo. Later, when she finished and turned to leave, he stopped her. "Miriam." She froze. He stood slowly, the name foreign but right on his tongue. "You saved my life. You could have let them take me. You could have walked away. But you didn't." Her eyes glistened. He stepped closer, voice low. "You gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost." He didn't reach for her this time. He only bowed his head. "Thank you." She lifted a trembling hand and touched her fingers lightly to his cheek. It was the gentlest touch he had ever known. Then she turned and walked away before he could say another word. When she disappeared behind the curtain, he looked toward the crucifix, the candlelight flickering across its surface. "If you're up there," he whispered, "you sent her to break me, didn't you?" The flame wavered, caught the edge of the wooden cross, and glowed steady again. He sank onto the pew, covering his face with his hands. The smell of roses drifted through the air, faint and pure. Somewhere beyond the wall he could hear her footsteps fade, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of something holy inside his chest. Not guilt, not fear, something new, something that felt like love. And it terrified him more than death ever had. The desert had turned cold again, the kind of cold that cut through wool and bone alike. The moon hung low, swollen and white above the chapel roof. From inside came the faint glow of candles, the rhythm of a single breath, and the fragile sound of wood settling in the wind. Eli lay awake on the cot near the hearth. He hadn't slept properly in days. The storm had left the roof scarred, and he'd spent every waking hour mending beams and sealing cracks. But the work wasn't what kept him up. It was Miriam. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing in the flickering light, her face inches from his, her hand trembling against his cheek. He hadn't felt that kind of touch since before his life had fallen apart. He turned over, staring at the faint silhouette of the organ. She was sitting there again, shoulders straight, veil slipping loose around her neck. She played so quietly that the music barely reached him. Yet every note seemed to find him anyway, weaving through the air like a whisper meant only for his soul. He watched her until guilt forced him to look away. Whatever lived between them had grown into something neither of them could name. It frightened him. She had given her life to God. He'd given his to sin. There was no road that led from one to the other. When the last chord faded, she sat still for a long while. Then she stood, blew out the nearest candle, and disappeared behind the curtain. Eli listened to her footsteps retreat to the small room beyond the altar. Only when silence settled again did he breathe. He couldn't stay. He told himself that 100 times that night. She deserved peace, not the shadow of an outlaw haunting her chapel. At dawn he would go, head south, cross the border, disappear. He'd leave her the patched roof, the rebuilt fences, the small miracles of labor he could offer, and take nothing more. He closed his eyes and tried to picture it. The road stretching ahead, empty and sunburnt, the horizon swallowing him whole. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like dying all over again. He must have drifted off because when he woke, the first light of morning was spilling through the window, soft and gray. Miriam was already outside, kneeling in the garden. He watched her through the open door. She was humming. No words, just a faint tune that matched the rise and fall of her breath. It was the first sound he had ever heard from her mouth, and it made his chest ache in a way he didn't understand. He stepped outside quietly. The air smelled of wet soil and rosemary. She didn't notice him until his shadow fell across the roses. When she looked up, her eyes were gentle, unafraid. "I'm leaving after sundown," he said. Her hands stilled in the dirt. "It's better this way," he continued. "If I stay, those men will come back. You don't need that trouble." She rose slowly, brushing dust from her knees, and met his gaze. There was a long silence between them, longer than usual, heavy with all the things she could never say. Then she reached for the small slate she used to write on. Her hand shook as she scribbled the words. "You don't have to run." He stared at them, then shook his head. "That's all I've ever done, sister. It's the only thing I know how to do." She erased the words and wrote again. "You can stay." "I can't," he said. "You think God forgives everything, but the world doesn't. They'll hang me if they find me. You shouldn't pay the price for what I've done." She hesitated, then pressed the chalk harder. "Then, let me pay it." The words hit him like a fist. He caught her wrist before she could write again. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't throw your life away for mine." Her eyes filled, bright as morning water. She didn't pull her hand back. For one breath, the space between them felt too small, too full of everything they'd been holding back. Then she stepped away and turned toward the chapel, leaving him with nothing but the whisper of her skirt and the echo of that silent plea. All that day he worked restlessly, chopping wood that didn't need cutting, patching fences that didn't need fixing. Anything to drown the voice inside him that said he wanted to stay. By evening, the horizon burned orange. He packed his saddlebag, checked the revolver, and led the horse to the front steps. Miriam stood there waiting, her hands clasped around the rosary. The light caught her veil, making her look almost unreal. He swallowed hard. "Guess this is goodbye." She didn't move. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You deserve peace." Still, she said nothing, but her eyes begged him to stop. He tipped his hat. "Thank you for everything." He swung into the saddle and turned toward the road. The horse snorted, hooves crunching against dry earth. The sky darkened to deep crimson. He looked back once, saw her silhouette framed by the chapel door, small and still. Then he rode down the hill. He made it less than a mile. The first gunshot shattered the quiet. The horse reared, screaming. Eli ducked low, eyes scanning the ridge. 3 riders burst from the shadows, the bounty hunters. He fired twice, dropping one from the saddle, but pain tore through his arm as another bullet grazed him. The horse panicked, bolting back toward the chapel. He didn't fight it. His vision blurred, his grip slipping. The world tilted, then went black. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the chapel floor again, the air thick with smoke. Miriam knelt beside him, pressing a cloth to his wound. Her hands were shaking. Somewhere outside, voices shouted orders, boots thudding against the ground. He tried to rise. "They're here," he rasped. "You've got to run." She pushed him back down, eyes fierce. "They'll kill you if they find me here." She shook her head violently, her breath coming fast. He saw the terror in her face, but also something else. Resolve. The door slammed open. 3 men filled the doorway, guns drawn. The tallest stepped forward, smirking. "Evenin', sister. Looks like you finally found your voice after all." "Heard tell you're harborin' a fugitive." Miriam stood, blocking Eli with her body. The man chuckled. "Move aside, lady. Ain't no sermon gonna save this one." Eli struggled to his knees. "Leave her out of this. I'll come quiet." "Quiet?" The man laughed. "You think hanging's quiet?" He cocked his revolver. And then, before Eli could move, before any of them could, Miriam spoke. "Stop." The word cracked through the air like thunder. Her voice, hoarse, unused, trembling, filled the chapel and froze every man where he stood. For 6 years she hadn't spoken a single word, and now it came out rough and raw, yet steady, strong enough to make even the wind pause. The bounty hunter blinked. "Well, I'll be damned." "You will be," she said, louder now. "Not here, not in this house." The men hesitated, glancing at one another. Eli stared up at her in disbelief. Hearing her voice felt like hearing sunlight. She stepped forward, her hand outstretched, the rosary clutched tight. "This man is under God's mercy. If you spill blood here, you'll curse yourselves," the tall man sneered. "You think God cares what happens to a murderer?" "Yes," she said. Her voice wavered but didn't break. "Because even murderers can be forgiven. I know. I've asked for it every day." Something in her tone silenced even the cruelest of them. The leader lowered his gun slightly. "You're a brave woman, sister, but he's worth money we can't just walk away from." Eli forced himself to stand, gripping the pew for balance. "Let her be. I'll go with you." "No!" Miriam said sharply. Her voice cracked, the sound breaking the air like glass. She moved between Eli and the hunters, eyes blazing. "He belongs to God now. You'll not take him from his hand." The men shifted, uneasy. One muttered, "She's crazy." But the leader hesitated. Something in her, the authority of faith, or madness, or both, held him at bay. Finally, he spat into the dust. "Fine. You want him so bad, you keep him." "Ain't worth shootin' a nun," he signaled to his men, and they backed away, muttering. The sound of hooves faded into the night. For a long time, neither Miriam nor Eli moved. The candle flames wavered in the sudden quiet. Her breathing was ragged. She swayed, catching herself on the pew. He caught her shoulders. "You talked," he whispered. "You broke your vow." Her lips trembled. God forgives vows kept too long. The sound of her voice tore through him. Rough, soft, beautiful. He lifted her hands to his chest. "You saved me." Tears welled in her eyes. "You saved me first." He wanted to hold her, to tell her she'd given him back his soul, but he couldn't speak for the lump in his throat. She smiled faintly, weak with exhaustion. Then she crumpled. He caught her before she hit the floor. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse fluttering beneath his fingers. He carried her to the cot, laid her down, and covered her with the blanket. She didn't wake for hours. He sat beside her, candlelight flickering over her face, the echo of her voice still alive in the air. When dawn finally came, she stirred. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then finding him. "You should have gone," she whispered. He shook his head. "Not anymore. I'm done running." Her lips curved faintly. "Then stay. Help me rebuild." He leaned close. "If I stay, it's not for redemption anymore. It's for you." She looked at him for a long time, then reached up and touched his face. "Then maybe both." The light outside turned gold, spilling across the cracked walls. He looked toward the window, then back at her. "You know, your voice. It's not what I imagined." She smiled faintly. "Neither was you." He laughed softly, the sound breaking years of bitterness. Outside, the desert stirred awake. Inside, the chapel breathed again, alive with something greater than prayer, a pulse of new beginnings. She closed her eyes and murmured, almost to herself, "Silence kept me safe. But love brought me back." He bowed his head beside her. "Amen to that." The wind outside carried the sound of bells from the distant town, each ring like a heartbeat against the sky. And for the first time in both their lives, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was holy. The sun rose over the desert like a promise reborn, soft and slow, painting the cracked horizon in strokes of gold and crimson. The light crept through the chapel windows, washing over the walls that still smelled faintly of gunpowder and candle wax. Inside, Sister Miriam lay in her narrow bed, her breath steady, her skin pale beneath the morning glow. Eli sat beside her, the night still heavy in his eyes. He had not slept. Every time her breath caught, every time her fingers twitched in dreams, he thought she might slip away. He'd never prayed in his life the way he prayed then. No words, no bargains, just a desperate whisper from somewhere deep in his chest, where faith had never dared to live before. When she stirred, opening her eyes to the light, his whole body sagged with relief. Her voice, fragile but alive, broke the quiet. "You're still here." "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "Not anymore." She blinked against the light, a faint smile touching her lips. "Then the world must be ending." He laughed, the sound raw and cracked, but full of life. "Maybe it's just startin'." For the next few days he wouldn't leave her side. The bounty hunters hadn't returned, though the memory of them lingered like dust on the wind. Miriam was weak, her body paying the price of what her spirit had done. But she insisted on tending to small things, lighting candles, watering the roses. He tried to stop her, but she only looked at him with that steady gaze that always disarmed him. She could speak now, though not often. Her voice was rough from years of silence, but every word she gave him felt like a gift. Sometimes she'd hum while she worked, and the sound filled the chapel like sunlight through glass. He repaired what the storm and the fight had broken. He built new pews from cedar boards hauled from town, mended the door, even carved a small wooden crucifix to replace the one that had splintered in the chaos. The work gave him purpose, something he'd never known outside a gun barrel. At night, they'd sit together near the hearth. The air grew cold after sunset, and he'd pile wood on the fire while she read by its light. She would read aloud now, her voice uncertain at first, gaining strength with each verse. The first time he heard her say the words, "Forgive us our trespasses." His throat closed up. He wasn't sure who she meant, herself or him, but maybe it didn't matter. Sometimes he'd tell her stories about the road, the kind that made her laugh quietly. Once, he told her about the time he stole a preacher's horse just to escape a town mob. "Horse was named Mercy," he said. "Guess God's got a sense of humor." She smiled, shaking her head. "Maybe he just knew you'd end up here." He stared at the fire. "Don't feel like I belong anywhere else anymore." Days turned to weeks. Word reached him that the territorial marshal had sent out a notice. Eli Cade was no longer wanted dead. One of the hunters had confessed that Eli had spared his life during that shootout near the border. The law had changed its mind. Eli didn't know what to do with that kind of freedom. For the first time, no one was chasing him. He could go anywhere. But when he looked at Miriam, kneeling before the altar, her veil glowing in the candlelight, he knew his road had already ended here. The town began to notice him too. At first they kept their distance, whispers of the outlaw who'd found God. But soon they saw the way he worked, the way he bowed his head beside the nun when they prayed for rain or buried the dead. People began to bring bread, supplies, even laughter back to San Miguel. The chapel that once echoed with emptiness now rang with voices again. One afternoon, a group of children came running through the gate, chasing each other with ribbons. Miriam stood at the door watching them. "They sound like bells," she said. He leaned against the doorway, wiping sweat from his brow. "Never thought I'd see this place full again." "Neither did I." A long silence stretched between them, not heavy, not uncertain, just peaceful. He looked at her, her face softened by the fading light. "I used to think peace was what came after death," he said. "Turns out it just needed a place to sit a while." She turned toward him, eyes glimmering. "And where does it sit now?" He smiled faintly. "Right here." He touched his chest. Her gaze dropped to his hand, then lifted again. "You've changed." "Maybe I finally stopped being scared." "Of what?" He hesitated. "Of being forgiven." Her expression softened. "Forgiveness isn't something we earn. It's something we choose to believe in." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. That night, the wind howled through the hills again, carrying the smell of rain. The desert sky flashed with distant lightning. Inside, Miriam lit the last of the candles and began to play the organ. The sound rose like prayer, each note trembling against the storm. Eli watched her, his heart full and aching. When she finished, he walked to her side. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked quietly. She turned, surprised. "Why would I?" He shrugged. "You've been buried out here for years. You could go anywhere now. There's towns, schools, hospitals that need someone like you." She looked at him for a long time. "And you?" He hesitated. "I'd follow, I reckon, if you asked." Her lips parted, but no words came. Then she shook her head, smiling faintly. "This chapel is my penance and my home. I think it's yours too." He nodded slowly. "Guess I knew you'd say that." They stood there, the thunder rolling in the distance. She reached for his hand, not a sister of faith reaching for a sinner, but one soul finding another. Their fingers intertwined, and the warmth between them said what words never could. The storm broke before dawn. Rain fell hard against the roof, pounding like 1,000 whispered amens. Miriam woke early and went outside, letting the water soak her veil, her hands, her face. Eli followed her, laughing quietly as she lifted her arms to the sky. "It's been years since it rained like this," she said over the noise. "Maybe heaven's cleaning the slate." She looked back at him, her smile shining through the rain. "Maybe so." He took a step closer, close enough to see the drops clinging to her eyelashes. The moment hung between them, fragile as glass. He could have kissed her then, and maybe he should have. But he didn't. She belonged to God. And he had finally learned what love meant when it asked for nothing in return. They stood there until the rain eased and the world smelled of life again. Afterward, she returned to the chapel to prepare for the evening mass. He followed, helping her light candles and straighten benches. When the villagers arrived, the small church filled with faces. Men, women, and children who hadn't prayed together in years. Miriam stood at the front, her voice steady now as she sang the hymn of grace. Eli stood in the back, hat in hand, listening. Each note she sang seemed to heal another piece of him. When the last song faded and the people drifted away, he approached her. "You've got the whole town believin', again." She smiled. "Not me, you. They saw what mercy looks like." He chuckled. "You give me too much credit." She shook her head. "No, you gave them hope. You gave me hope." For a long moment they stood in silence. The candles flickered. Outside, the world smelled of wet earth and renewal. "Miriam," he said softly. "Yes? You ever think about what comes next?" Her eyes softened. "Every day." "I don't know if I'll ever be the man I should have been," he said, "but I want to keep trying. Here, with you." She reached up, resting a hand over his heart. "Then try. That's all God ever wanted." He nodded, voice thick. "Then I'll stay." She smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Then we'll both be where we're meant to be." He took her hand and kissed it gently, reverently. That night, as darkness fell, he lit one last candle and placed it before the altar. She joined him, her veil brushing his arm. Together they knelt, two broken souls mended not by miracles but by mercy. When she began to pray aloud, her voice was strong now, clear and unwavering. "Lord, thank you for bringing light to the lost. Thank you for teaching us that silence can heal. But love gives it meaning." He closed his eyes, her words sinking deep. The candlelight wavered, throwing their shadows together on the wall behind the cross. It looked almost like one figure. Two hearts finally bound in peace. Outside, the desert was still. The storm had passed, leaving the air cool and clean. Far beyond the chapel, the first morning star rose over the horizon, shining bright as hope reborn. Eli reached for her hand again. She didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, watching the light flicker, the world turning quiet around them. In the end, it wasn't the silence that defined them. It was what came after, the voice that broke it, the forgiveness that followed, the love that stayed. And in that small chapel at the edge of the desert, beneath the same sky that had once watched them bleed and pray, they finally found what neither gunfire nor grief had ever given them. Peace. In a world where bullets once spoke louder than prayers, two wounded souls found peace not in words, but in silence, and in the love that rose quietly between them. For Sister Miriam and Eli Cade, redemption wasn't given by heaven alone. It was built by kindness, courage, and the grace of forgiveness. Because sometimes, the softest voices are the ones that change a heart forever. If you are moved by their story, don't forget to subscribe to the Wild West Love Chronicles channel, where every tale brings the untamed frontier to life through love, loss, and the healing power of second chances. Saddle up, partner. More heart-stealing stories await.